From the University of Colorado at Boulder, Rocky Mountain Animal Defense presents Empty Cages, Animal Rights and Why They Matter.
Thank you, Lisa, for a very kind introduction. And Alan, thank you very much for helping arrange the logistics and all those who helped with publicity. I thank you. And I thank all of you for coming, because I know that we are all busy people. We all have important things to do. And so taking the time to come here rather than be doing something else that's important for your life and important for your interest means so much to me personally, and so much to my wife Nancy, and so much to those of us who are involved in the struggle for animal rights, because you voted with your feet here. You've come. I want to encourage all of you to make connections with the local organizations if you haven't already done so, because we all know the axiom about thinking globally and acting locally. There really are problems right here that need to be tended to, beginning with this dog lab right here. I'll be happy to come back when the dog lab's closed to help you celebrate, so you just let me know when that day comes. I also, though, want to encourage you to think about the Culture and Animals Foundation. There's information about our organization out there, and our annual festival, which Lisa's been coming to for at least the last 5 years. It's a wonderful opportunity, and we'd appreciate seeing all of you again in Raleigh, North Carolina. That's east of here, as I recall. I want to see if my machine is working here. This is always the moment of truth. It'll take a minute to warm up. But it is a great pleasure for me to be here and to meet with all you folks and to have the opportunity to share my ideas and my life experience with you. I personally don't think that I have the power to change anybody's life in the next half hour or so. I know that there are these evangelical meetings where people come and they make our decision and they change their life, but I don't think I have that power to do that. I don't think animal rights, in fact, is an idea like that. I think some people are born to the idea. I've met people who, from the very earliest awareness, from their earliest memories, they knew that they were on the side of the animals. They had that compassion, that empathy for animals, and they didn't have to be taught that. They didn't have to be convinced to be that way. They just kind of were born that way. And I'm sure some of you are in this room. I'm sure there always are some people like that in this room. Then there are other people who have these like road to Damascus experiences. They're Paul one day and Saul the next, if you know what I mean. Something happens. And it's not like an argument, or it's not like a process. It's just they're transformed. They see something. They go someplace. They go to a slaughterhouse, for example, or they see a film about trapping, or about fur ranching, and they're just changed, just like that. But then there are the rest of us that aren't born that way and aren't transformed in a minute. I call us the muddlers. We just kind of muddle along. And we learn this, we learn that, and we do this, we do that. And there's a long process. In a way, the movement makes us rather than we make the movement. And I've certainly been a muddler in my life. I wasn't born that way, and I didn't have a transforming experience. It's just one thing, and then another thing, and then another thing, and then you end up someplace, and you look back, and you don't recognize who you are. And you don't know how that happened. And so you try to reconstruct it. So I thought I would share with you some of the things that have happened in my life, in my journey, and then also share some of the ideas that are the substance of my position as a philosopher. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as was Nancy, when Pittsburgh was the steel capital of the world. And it's a part of Pittsburgh that we honor to this day, as all you sports fans know, by having a team called the Pittsburgh Steelers. Go Steelers! Go Steelers, right. And especially those of you who are Denver Bronco fans, I'm sorry, go Steelers. And when we were living in Pittsburgh at the time, Pittsburgh, as I said, was the steel capital of the world, and the mills worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And the pollution was so bad that there were some days, especially when the sky was really heavy, which is very often in Pittsburgh, I might say that you could look out and you couldn't tell whether it was 12 o'clock midnight or 12 o'clock noon, as in this picture here. That's what it was like to live in Pittsburgh at the time. My mother and father were born in Pittsburgh. They're now deceased. But my mother and father were both born in Pittsburgh, and they came from poor working class families. My mother went to the 7th grade, and that was the end of her education, formal education. My father went to the 8th grade. That was the end of his formal education. And after that, they had to go out and get a job and work to help support their family, meet life's necessities. So that's the kind of environment I was born into. I didn't come from any kind of blue collar or blue blood family. I have only blue collar blood in my veins, I always say. There's nothing royal or anything. And I was the first person on both sides of my family, both my father's side and my mother's side, to go to college. I mean, that was just nothing. That was something that never happened in that working class family there. So for my mom and dad, when they first got married, they came from this hardship. They got married and the country went into a depression, the Great Depression. And there are people here, I see some of you who are old enough to understand what I'm about to say. This is hard for younger people to understand. But my mother and father never left a depression. I mean, they were born, they came through that depression, and they knew what it was like to scrimp and save and do without, and didn't know whether you're going to be able to buy bread tomorrow, and they felt that way their whole life. They lived that way. They scrimped and saved, never got out of it. But they were terribly proud of their children and totally supportive of everything we did. But for them to have a house, this is the home where I was born in Pittsburgh's North Side, to actually have a house for them was an amazing thing. This is where they rented this, and eventually they built a home. But it was an amazing thing. The animals that I knew when I was growing up in those circumstances in an industrial center in Pittsburgh were companion animals. This is a dog of ours. That good-looking guy is me there. I mean, one time we had like 30 inches of snow in Pittsburgh. It was one of the biggest snowfalls ever. And it was such an incredible thing to happen, because when you have that kind of snowfall, all the ordinary rules of day-to-day life were suspended. So like dogs who always had to stay in were allowed to run all over the place. And this is one of my favorite photographs in my whole life, because this dog we had, who was confined mainly to a small yard and had very little freedom and very little excitement, she was allowed to go out and run in the snow. And she was just so happy. And it's, as I say, one of my fondest memories. But I had no connection with animals. My mother and father, the one luxury they allowed themselves was food. And they were it was an American home. And for them coming through the Depression, to be able to put meat on the table, where in the Depression you couldn't have that, you couldn't afford that. Be able to put that on the table meant my father was succeeding. It was more than nutrition. It was a symbol of success. And so I always say, I dined enthusiastically at the trough of tradition. I mean, if you put a steak on the table, I ate it. Pork chops, lamb chops, turkey, chicken, everything. They tried to sneak liver in. I never did like liver, but I mean, they tried to sneak liver in. I didn't like that, but I ate everything, enthusiastically. In fact, then, when the time came when I went off to college and had to earn money to help pay to go to college, I took the job that was available. I worked in a butcher shop. My job was to grind the meat, and my job was to pack the chickens and put the chickens on the rotisserie, that kind of thing, and to put all the cold cuts out and display them. And there was a thing called city chicken. You made city chicken out of small pieces of pork and small pieces of veal, and you put it on a stick. I would do that. I wasn't a great skilled butcher like the really good butchers. I was just a kind of novice butcher. But that's what I did to earn money. 50 cents an hour I made. It was good money back then. It's the best money I could make anyhow. And I always say, I didn't find butchering bloody, I found it bloody hard. I had no moral qualms about it, no aesthetic qualms about it. I had eyes and did not see, and ears and did not hear. It was all around me. I was surrounded by it. But it moved me not. Not at all. What did move me, in fact, was not animals. It wasn't like I looked in their eyes at this point in my life and was transformed. It was something else. It was really something going on in my head. I'm now a university professor, and there's a war going on in Vietnam. And people the age of my students, I'm a young professor back there, but students the age of my students, young men and women the age of my students were coming home in body bags, day after day after day, in a war that Nancy and I thought was totally unjustified. And so we became activists in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam period. We, along with other people, organized the state of North Carolina, North Carolinians against the war. And we worked in the ways that we could to try to bring pressure on our government to bring an end to the war. The images of war we saw, the casualties, the innocent civilians that were being caught up in the war, and the soldiers on both sides that were dying because of the war. And I thought to myself at the time, I'm a trained philosopher. I should be able to do something to contribute to this movement in addition to going out and protesting as we did. I mean, I'm back there in the right-hand corner up there in the big demonstration in Washington. This was this great demonstration, great historical moment in the anti-war movement. I should be able to do something as a philosopher rather than as an organizer and a street activist and a protester and all that. So I thought, I'll start reading. That's the first thing you do as a thinker. You say, well, I'll start reading what other people have said about war and violence and aggression. And what happens here, if you take that path, this is inevitable. The day will come when you'll go someplace, a bookstore or a library, and you'll reach up and you'll pull down a book and it'll say, Gandhi, an autobiography, the story of my life. My experiments with truth, he talks about it, the subtitle, My Experiments with Truth. Gandhi. Now Gandhi, if you don't know anything about him, I encourage you to rent the film from Blockbusters, Gandhi. It's a great film. One thing it's not good about, it doesn't mention anything about Gandhi's animal views, which is very disappointing about the film, because it was essential to Gandhi. His animal views were essential to who he was and what he stood for. But Gandhi was a man of great simplicity. He was a saint compared to what I could be in terms of what he was, the austerity of his life. When he died, you may know this, when he died, he had his glasses, he had a wooden bowl, he had his sandals, and he had a dhoti. And that was the extent of his earthly possessions. He lived such a life of simplicity. Well, I'm not into that much simplicity myself, and I wasn't even then at the time. But he did ring true to me because he had a view about the war that was helpful to me. He had a view about violence. He said, look, violence is the intentional use of force to hurt someone. That's what violence is. You're trying to hurt somebody using this force. And so the idea was that Gandhi thought, Gandhi thought it was always wrong to use violence. He was a pacifist. He thought that if in the face of the Nazis, the thing to do was to try to reason with them. He thought that in the face of someone attacking your child, that it would be impermissible for you to raise a hand. I'm sorry, but I'm just too much of a blue-collar person to think that way, I think. It must be the influence of the mills and the mines on me or something. But I never was able to buy into Gandhi's absolute pacifism. But I did understand what he was saying about the notion of violence, and that was what was wrong with the war. Because here we were using violence and we couldn't justify hurting people. The onus is on you to justify the use of violence because you're intentionally hurting somebody. And that's what we thought. Well, we couldn't do that. And so it was a key to my being able to lecture in the anti-war movement and talk about the philosophical foundations of the anti-war movement, short of Gandhi.